I wanted to try to influence writing amongst our constituency and the teaching of writing to have more heart as well as head. Appealing to human beings in their fullness is what rhetoric is really about. And so the appeals to reason as well as to the passions and emotions are really what I think I have to offer. And I think that will translate into essays that really have a lot more, they're more real, they're more from the heart and to the heart, and they'll be therefore more impactful. If you think about it, the best writers are not people who only are very logical all the time. Logic is important. We don't want to slide into the abyss of relativism. We need to check our claims for universality and for consistency and so forth. That's a given. But if all you're brought up to do is to appeal to the head only, I'm not even sure you can do Christian writing. St. Ambrose said that God did not choose dialectic as a means of saving his people. What does this mean? Jesus spoke in parables. Spiritual truth is a matter of head and heart. I'll leave it at that. If you're trapped in your head, you're going to miss a lot. So, I'm glad that the kiddos are here because I'm specifically trying to equip them to be competitive in what we're looking for. I believe, I'm kind of out of the loop now, but I believe that the CCLE essay contest is going to increasingly expect that the essays have more head and heart appeals, more voice from the students, and are more flesh and blood.
This year did have more.
Yeah. Well, you probably have me to thank for that. You know, just nagging people. You know, the sterile kind of surgical treatment of the topic has got to go. Okay. All right. So, how do you do that? Well, the other target audience for this is obviously going to be the people who are trying to teach their children how to write in an engaging way. I'm of the persuasion that writing in that fashion is more engaging to the reader, and therefore more effectual because you're going to captivate their interest, their enthusiasm, if I can use that word, in the proper way. You need to be passionate about some things, or, you know. So teaching this will be the other prong of what I'm attempting to accomplish today. So here are the practical tips for teaching, but back on rhetoricring.com, if we go back to the Emporium, the Speech Builders Emporium is a place to go. I'm going to pause this. That's a sound file. I have a little gem about the Canon of Style. The first thing to understand, I'm starting with the Canon of Style because I want to fast track to that. But there are 5 classical canons of rhetoric that one should pay attention to in order to write a really dynamite essay. These can be understood as the sub-arts of the art of rhetoric, okay? And the art of rhetoric has to do with persuasive discourse, writing persuasive arguments. Not everything you're going to write on will be persuasive, but you can generalize a lot of this for informative writing, analytical writing, okay? For example, when you're writing something, let's say you were an apostle writing an epistle, you might want to use some sort of running analogy to illustrate the analytic point you're making, right? Okay. So the canons have to, in fact, the Canon of Style has to do with vivid imagery and rhythm. I'll get to that in one second. So they are invention, arrangement or disposition. This is like the blueprint that you work from. And then style. Style asks two questions. Where is emphasis needed in terms of rhythm and imagery? And then invention, disposition, style, memory, and delivery. Question. How many of you would say, I could use a little rundown on each of those? All right. Okay. Because I assume all the kids have studied this already. Anyway, here's the rundown. The 5 classical canons of rhetoric were developed as a means of, it's a grammar of the arts of rhetoric. And so it's based on what steps must you go through in order to make a complete persuasive argument. The first thing you need to do, so this is a guide to crafting a case, is one way to think of it. This has strong forensic application, court of law, okay? So in order to fully persuade about a case, you need to first of all ask the question, what is there to say? And then you select your materials with which you craft your speech or your case. Okay, so that's what invention deals with. The Greek word for invention is heuresis. A heuristic is what Bacon calls promptuary. It asks questions that guide lines of inquiry. Where are they going? The crux of the matter. Okay, that actually has to do with rhetorical reasoning, which is what I usually talk about here. That's my old saw. My dog and pony show has to do with rhetorical reasoning, which is the art of discovering the crux of the matter in debatable issues. Another session. But I wanted to point out that invention is tied directly to that. The art of rhetorical invention is a whole interesting study, and it impinges on reasoning processes in cases where the crux of the matter is not that clear. And it's very interesting how that all works. And pastors, it has a lot to do with casuistry. Okay, so the next question you have to ask is, now that I've gathered these materials and narrowed my topic and decided which lines of argument I would like to develop in my case, how do I arrange them such that they will be most effectual? So disposition is the blueprint. The synonym for this one is arrangement. You might have seen that in your textbook. Okay, and then once you've organized your thoughts, then you have to ask yourself, where is emphasis needed? Not every point is equally important in any given speech. So that suggests that you need to crescendo at certain points. Okay, so style is an art of emphasis, and it utilizes figures of speech in order to build rhythm, crescendo, right? And diminution, waxing and waning tides, right? I have a dream. I have a dream. Okay? Rhythm, imagery, vivid imagery, don't even have to elaborate, I don't think. Figures of speech that deal with imagery. Okay, so you will find all of that on this page, and I have a handy-dandy PDF of my little down and dirty treatment of figures of speech. I just wanted to point out, these are called glossary of schemes and tropes because figures of speech are divided into schemes and tropes. Tropes have to do with the imagery, and schemes have to do with a deliberate, here's how it's defined on this page, a deliberate manipulation of the ordinary arrangement of words for rhetorical effect. This is a parallel definition. Tropes are defined as a deliberate manipulation of the ordinary meaning of words for a rhetorical effect. So in other words, artfully arranging things, for example, in parallel fashion in order to build to a crescendo is a scheme. And there are figures for that. What's one? What is used in the catechism all the time, Pastor?
What, for a pattern? Like what
Yeah.
does this mean?
Yeah, what does this mean? Has rhetorical effect because of its...
Love God,
So that, yeah, using those constructions. How about couplets? How about antitheses? Huh? Antithesis is a figure of speech, right? It's a scheme. What does it do? How does this work? I could use that as a repetition. How does this work? Rhetoric thinks about how language works in order to aid memory, in this case, or provide emphasis. I have a dream. I have a dream. And if you can use to artfully use those devices, your writing and your speaking will have more punch. Okay, that's why we study those. Memory and delivery, blah, blah, blah. Lost canons of rhetoric, they're called. Oh, there it is. Yeah. Go away. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to show you. I have a tendency to point people toward my Rhetoric Ring because really it's like an online textbook. It's not that clear though. It is a ring. It's convoluted. I'm sorry, it's how I think. But it's all connected. It's interconnected. And that's because rhetoric is interconnected with a lot of disciplines. But there's a page also on there for the 3 modes of artistic proof of Aristotle. Let me just tell you about those. You've already heard of them. They're actually even utilized in movies. I saw one of those Marvel comic movies. It's not Sin City, but it's another one that came out about the time of Sin City. And there was this one actor that was cloned several times, and it took on different iterations as they were killed and then cloned. But the first 3 were Ethos, Pathos, and Logos. Do you remember that? It's so funny. All I can remember is this actor looked a little bit like Curly in the Three Stooges. But I can't remember his name. He speaks with a lisp, too. Anyway, his first iteration was Ethos, Pathos, and Logos. And they killed him off, and then they came up with another Trinitarian grouping. It's probably an inside joke for the comic book writer. But I thought it was fun that the first ones were called Ethos, Pathos, and Logos. So the famous and very common treatment of these artistic modes of proof goes like this. Here's my wrap on the 3 modes of artistic proof. Number 1 is Aristotle points out that that proofs are the most important thing about persuasion. And there are 2 kinds, inartistic and artistic. Inartistic proofs are just laying around, you gather them and use them, like testimony or hard evidence, and you actually list torture as one of them. That's testimony gained by torture. You don't manufacture that through rules of art, you just utilize what was already spoken. Okay, that's actually debatable, isn't it?
Yes.
The intelligence community doesn't consider testimony gained under torture very reliable because you can influence it heavily through your art. Okay, so artistic proofs, Aristotle says, my treatise on rhetoric is going to be all about how to be well supplied with lines of argument that are crafted through rules of art. This is going to make my treatise on rhetoric superior to that of the sophists. They're just teaching people how to manipulate others. I'm going to teach you an art. I'm going to impart an art of rhetoric. And so he says, he subdivides, like he is wont to do, 3 parts, the art of rhetoric. There are 3 types of proof that one crafts through the rules of arts. The first is ethos. Ethos, he says, is probably the most important tool that the rhetor has because it involves trust between the speaker and the audience. Why would I be persuaded by you if I don't trust you? If you come across like somebody who doesn't know what he's talking about, or you're speaking nonsense, or your arguments don't really hold water. I guess that would be more under logos, but that affects your ethos as well. You don't seem like you know what you're talking about. So he puts that first, and it's really interesting. This is more for the teachers. If you look at Rhetoric, book 2, right at the beginning, he further subdivides ethos into 3 terms: arete, phronesis, and dianoia. So good sense, goodwill, and good moral character are the 3 This is why that passage and other statements by Aristotle about not using lies to persuade us, that's why I argue vociferously that rhetoric, true rhetoric, is ethical all the way down. Arete is the Greek word for what? Virtue.
Yes.
Phronesis is goodwill. Toward whom? Toward my neighbor. I speak the truth. I'm attempting to persuade you using true arguments because I don't want to warp your soul. Okay, so ethos is important. Logos is a given. Our writers of our essay contest that participate in our essay contest don't have much of a problem with making a logical argument. That's our inheritance from the Enlightenment era. We're good at that still, and we're conservative people, so we value very strongly making clear logical arguments, and we have a strong theological emphasis in our group, and so we have that influence as well because theology is done very systematically and logically, okay? But when it comes to pathos and style, there's a bit of a lack there, and I saw evidence of that when I was grading these essays. Because the kids didn't know how to write an interesting argument that was captivating to the reader because I don't think it was emphasized with them that much. And some of them were just too young to do that. I mean, let's just get that out of the way right now. I'm speaking to this age group. I'm not even speaking about the little ones. I think they do just parrot what they're told.
Right.
That's how it is. And so I can't help much with that. And I don't think people need that much help with it anyway. It's kind of common sense. But they should start developing an ear for musicality in language, and they should start developing an appreciation for rhyme scheme and that sort of thing. So, I mean, you can work with them. But in terms of producing, writing, and speaking that is gripping and intriguing, do you know what one of the other definitions for, I think this comes from Plato too, actually. One of the other definitions for rhetoric is the enchantment of the soul. He's making a comment there about movement, in the principle of internal movement. That rhetoric is kind of like the enchantment. It's what motivates the soul. It's what gives the soul motion toward what? Toward the good. What was Plato always concerned about? Moving the soul toward the good. There's this whole analogy in the Phaedrus about the charioteer and how the soul sprouts wings. And so the enchantment of the soul is the job of rhetoric, rightly conceived. That boils down to, friends, please get beyond all of the implications. This is the problem when you start teaching rhetoric. There's so many tie-ins, so many dots that have to be connected, it's easy to just spin off into oblivion. All the time when I'm teaching, people are going, they just lay back and start thinking about this, that, and the other. And I certainly don't help that at all. I feed that. But please, in this instance, think about that when you are talking about appealing to the heart, you're essentially talking about moving the soul of your audience toward the good. And you do that by piquing the imagination, which stirs the emotions, which moves the will. Okay, if you don't have a notebook in your hand and a pen, please stand up now and say this with me. That's only about 4 people in the room. That's too embarrassing. Okay, where you sit, just think of it this way. In order to move the soul of your audience, which is to say, in order to write an essay with heart that is, involves more your voice than just your reasoning, you need to pique the imagination, which stirs the emotions, which moves the will, or moves the soul. The will is a part of the soul. Okay. So, piquing the imagination, figures of speech. Do I need to say any more? I already set that up. Stirring the emotions. Oh, no, no, no. Yes, yes, yes. Within balance, proportionally, tastefully. Okay, this is all taught, if it's taught intelligently, in terms of wise use and not overdoing it, not overblown emotional appeals. Those warp the soul as well, right? Okay. Fear is a great example. It illustrates it perfectly. I teach against extreme fear appeals all the time because people use those as a first resort in society today because they're so out of whack and they're activists and they have that mentality, you know. So play on people's fears. No. But does that mean we should extricate fear appeals from our rhetoric at all times? We should be afraid of some things. Yeah? Okay. So appealing to emotions is not bad. Write that down. Appealing to emotions is not bad. In fact, write this down. It is a compliment to human beings to appeal to their emotion and their imagination. Rationalists, empiricists, and enlightenment-oriented people decided we should eliminate all emotional appeals from our language. And as Richard Weaver, one of my heroes, who I learned most of this from, by the way, as Richard Weaver would say, what they accomplished was a denatured speech for a denatured man.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Do you understand that? Your language ultimately shapes your vision of humanity, your understanding of what human beings are made of, and for us, what it means to be created in God's image. And if you try to do away with heart appeals and imagination and analogy, which I link very strongly with sacramentalism, you know, things stand for other things. And to be able to reason from the physical to the spiritual is one of the marks of being created in God's image. And it's apparently something Jesus thought was very important. And so human excellence is tied up a lot in being able to do that. But if you eliminate that from your discourse religiously, you will create a situation that promotes a denatured speech for a denatured man. That's found in, everybody here should read this. You get it from the Intercollegiate Studies Institute for $12.95. Visions of Order, the cultural crisis of our time. If I did still have the Rhetoric Ring up here, I'm sorry, Visions of Order, the cultural crisis of our time. I got a little excited.
The cultural
Crisis of our time. Richard M. Weaver, it's his best work. Ideas Have Consequences is okay, but that's early.
Right.
Visions of Order was his most mature work, and it was published posthumously. All right, so anyway, I have a little shrine to Richard Weaver on the Rhetoric Ring. That's what I got excited about. I wanted to let you know. I have my 10 favorite Weaver essays, and one of them that's, I think, either number 2 or number 1 on the list is where I got that concept of a denatured speech for a denatured man. So those of my favorite 10 Weaver essays are worth a read. And, you know, I would be so tickled. Dr. Tallmon, are you always self-promoting because you point people to this? I've had 3 people since 2001 tell me how helpful they found my Rhetoric Ring. That's depressing for me. I'm laboring in obscurity. I'm not saying that so you feel sorry for me. I'm saying it's a fact. Nobody cares about this stuff, except there are some signs that, you know, the room's full. I'm excited about that. But in my discipline has imploded because they're so excited about deconstructionism, social construction of knowledge, and continental philosophy and all that stuff. They've rendered rhetorical studies irrelevant to people with a traditional outlook. And and people with a traditional outlook in rhetorical studies are non-entities. Okay, don't even waste our time with those folks. That's why I did this. That's why I did the Rhetoric Ring, because I couldn't get my stuff published through academic presses. They're like, yawn, you know, too traditional. So, yes, please pity me. No, that's not my point. My point is, you're my last best hope. I'm trying to recruit people to get interested in a traditional and ethical understanding of rhetoric and dialectic together as a way of cultivating wisdom and eloquence. That's my pitch for that, for the rhetorical revolution. I have until 11. Yes? Awesome. Okay, so let me wrap it up, and then we'll have some dialogue. Pathos and style are what's needed in order to pique the imagination, which stirs the emotions, which moves the soul. If your writing and your speaking is to move the soul of your auditors and your readers, you need to think about utilizing running analogies, for example. Let's include preaching in that. By the way, here's another plug. Paul Cain and I are going to do a 3-part series where I'm going to start it not unlike this session, giving an overview of teaching dialectic and rhetoric together, the relationship between dialectic and rhetoric, most of which I get from Richard Weaver. And my mentor, my debate coach in my bachelor's program, Charles Follett at Black Hills State University, was an Aristotelian Missouri Synod Lutheran who was doing his dissertation on Richard Weaver. So, you know, I'm just like a little automaton for that guy. Anyway, Paul Cain and I Paul Cain's been getting really fired up about all of these things, this truth about rhetoric, and he's like aching to help people understand how to apply this missing art to their sermonizing, to their homiletics. And it has actually, if you think about Paul being a Hellene, his epistles utilize a lot of syllogistic reasoning, dialectical inference, and figures of speech. Okay, so it pertains to hermeneutics as well. So anyway, our 3-part session is going to be all about that. He's going to take what my springboard, and he's going to dive right into the deep end on homiletics. So you're going to like that, I bet. Okay. I digressed from my wrap-up. My wrap-up was trying to say that pathos and style are really important to understand in terms of making your writing and your speeches engaging. It gives them flesh and blood, okay? And cultivating your voice. When somebody gives you a prompt and says, what did you learn about, or what do you think about this? They're not asking you to explain what it means. That's what people do a lot when they're not yet that mature to be able to formulate their thoughts and speak in their voice. So learning to, if you're passionate about something and learning to articulate that in a way that will bless other people or score points with them if they're judging you, or penetrate and get down to the heart level with them. Again, you use pathos and style in order to do that. And over time, people develop a style because they utilize, you know, think about, I keep alluding to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, John Kennedy's inaugural address. They had a style that they had cultivated. Bobby Kennedy gave a eulogy on Martin Luther King in downtown Indianapolis on the night Martin Luther King was assassinated. And all of his aides said, don't do it. Just cancel the engagement. He got up on a truck bed and he gave a eulogy to Martin Luther King to a virtually all black audience, and nobody rioted in Indianapolis that night. And when he wrote that, he didn't sit there and do an internet search and look through a bunch of materials to write it. He wrote it from his background, and he was quoting Aeschylus, and he was, you know, his favorite poet, he said. And so he had this habit. He was habituated. Hexis. Do you know the word? He had the moral habit of being inclined toward great thoughts. And people, a lot of time, their voice includes a lot of biblical allusions, people like us, because we're oriented toward biblical truth being most important. We elevate that, we privilege allusions to the Bible because they speak to us, and we hope they speak to others. Okay? Over time, your favorite biblical allusions will form your style. This is something that, you know, it's like Dr. Veith in vocation. It was actually a running joke at Patrick Henry College. Whenever he did chapel messages, you know, how long will it be before he mentions vocation? Not long. And I saw I have two former students from Emmanuel, Alexandria, Virginia, and they were just giggling to themselves. It took him how long to get to vocation this morning? You know, not even 5 minutes. So that becomes a mark of the style or the voice of that person. So that's a whole study actually in rhetorical criticism, is what are elements that you could identify as the character of that person's style, which is a large part of their character, okay? It's an index to what they value the most. Really interesting stuff. But what I wanted to point out is, if you think again about Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, you could characterize that speech this way. Each movement, I think there are 8 movements in that. If it were a symphony, it would have 8 movements. And each of them begins with parallelism. Let freedom ring. I have a dream. Now is the time. Okay? So there's a parallel repetition, and then each of them has a running metaphor, like the check, the bad check, the vaults of justice, the carving out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. So there's always either a running analogy or a powerful analogy or metaphor. And there's a lot of use of antithesis in there. Mountain of despair, stone of hope. Okay. So you can characterize his voice in terms of his habit of speaking in certain ways and utilizing certain figures and allusions. And it tells you a lot about what they value as a human being. If people habitually use allusions to scientific phenomena, they probably value very much causal phenomena. They have a scientific mind. Okay, so that tells you a little bit about their voice. I'm not going to get into that any further today because we need to wrap this up. But I did want to point out that your job as people your age is to start cultivating your voice. It coincides with gaining independence and becoming a young adult. And so think about it in terms of the kinds of allusions you utilize, the kinds of figures of speech you utilize, what you think is important. That's a given. Why do I believe what I believe and what's important to me? But that comes out in how you speak and how you write. And once you start doing that, you'll engage more people, you'll make more of a difference, and you'll win more speech contests. God bless you in your efforts.
I do have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
In the younger years, I teach K through 3, and introducing pathos at that level. Do you have any other ideas? The only thing I kind of do right now is make them use their spelling word in context. So it's
Yes.
coming out of their life and their sentences.
The rhetoric phase is the capstone of liberal arts education because of cognitive development. I believe that totally. That doesn't mean you shouldn't touch on it like Mrs. Russell's talking about here earlier, much earlier. Like I said, children need to be exposed to musicality and language, and everybody knows that, rhyme scheme and the like. That's why children learn nursery rhymes and such. So working with them on those things is important. Pathos, I'm not so sure if you want to get into that too early because they're not emotionally ready for that yet, probably. And if you started, you have to be very careful with classical education that you try to avoid training up Übermensch. That's not what classical education is designed for. And Luther actually teaches against that in his writings on education, because he says, you know, sometimes people that are driven to have their children do these really difficult readings and exercises, they're more concerned with their reputation than with the well-being of the children.
Because I do believe at that young level, I don't care what you think. I'm going to teach you right now, and later you'll be able to persuade.
And you'd be best, for a lot of these rhetorical constructs, it's best to leave the theory much later in, you know, like 10th grade and up. Because I really think theory should follow practice. Theory does inform practice, but the kids need to be, it's kind of like, when you're learning the piano, you would fail miserably if you start by having them learn theory and history of music, all about great composer, you know, just pile all of that on. There's a really strong analogy between how music is learned and how wisdom and eloquence are cultivated over time. Yes, ma'am.
I'm teaching at a high school level.
Great. You're in the right place.
And my question goes to how to introduce these kinds of concepts into the classroom. I understand giving them the information and the theory. But I think what I'm hearing you say is to provide good examples of writing in which you find examples of these things. Also, I believe I'm hearing you say, or I guess my question is, does it start with the assignment? How do I craft an assignment so that I'm trying to get them to go beyond just the logical, but also to take it into...
Having a discrete unit where you teach fallacies, and then where you teach logic, and then where you teach figures of speech, forget about that. That's a grammar approach to teaching tools. And yeah, sure, the fallacies can be taught, but the fallacies should be taught alongside examinations of literature or history or that sort of thing. The most success I've had teaching 6th, 7th, and 8th graders is when we read the Space Trilogy by C.S. Lewis, and I said, stop. Look what he's doing explaining the atmosphere of Venus. Stop and think about how glorious this is. How do you paint images that way deliberately? This wasn't an accident. He didn't just happen upon this description. He contemplated it, and he probably took a lot of walks in the country and, you know, had beers with his friends at the Eagle and Child. Anyway, it takes 2 years. I taught this to the Wittenberg faculty yesterday. I work on a 2-year cycle with kids that age to expose them to rhetorical concepts, ethos, pathos, and logos, and figures of speech, and we learn fallacies, and then we circle, and we come, and we grow, and I do about 3 debates a year for kids that age, where they first of all learn the fundamentals, and then we try to be a little bit more. I actually, when I have a debate, I have a skull session right in the middle of the debate where they slow down and think about applying 2 things, fallacies and figures of speech. In other words, do you have a running analogy you could utilize at the second half of the debate that would really drive your point home? Or are they committing a fallacy in your opinion? Call them on it. Hold their feet to the fire. Apply what you've been learning, right? So it's real deliberate. And so it takes time, just like learning the piano takes time. You don't just have, okay, now we're going to learn this about the piano. No, it's like a lot of practice, a lot of circling things, returning to study things, and then adding on over the years for a deeper understanding. That's how you cultivate tools as opposed to mastering content. Does that help?
I think so. So also when you have a writing selection and you take them through invention and then arrangement, and you're heading into, do you attach a specific style to it, or does it just come to you as you're studying a piece of literature that's attached to it?
Yeah, I think you should explore different types of, you know, and it might differ with a class. You kind of have to be sensitive and a little bit intuitive with some of these things to meet them where they're at and layer the learning and give them a variety of learning experiences.
Seems like most of my teaching comes in the rewriting.
Yeah.
And
yes.
Giving it to them,
yeah.
Letting them struggle through it, and then coming back
yes.
and dealing with the stylistic.
That's how habits get built.
Yes.
It becomes second nature eventually.
We pray.
Yeah. But that doesn't happen in a unit in 9 weeks.
I have a quick question. When you talk about style and finding the rhythm, is that just in prose, or do you also bring poetry in? I know Aristotle, he taught.
Totally.
Just tragedy.
Here are the classes that form what I consider the total foundation in training in rhetoric and dialectic. Introduction to public speaking. Okay, that's the foundation. That's 101. And then left brain, argumentation and debate.
Yeah.
Tie it all together, build on the foundation. Right brain, in Wittenberg Academy, that's rhetoric 2. Right brain would be oral interpretation of literature.
Right.
That's rhetoric 3 at Wittenberg Academy. And so you've got cultivation of style and pathos. I don't ignore those in the foundational class and in argumentation and debate, but I really dwell on them and utilize imitatio as a pedagogical method in rhetoric 3. And that's the foundation. And then advanced rhetorical theory. Then after they go through all that, as high school students, I would have them reading, primary works in rhetorical theory. And not whole works, selections.
Selections.
Yes.
Okay.
Do you want to mention the discussion this evening?
Yeah, sure.
Well, you don't have to.
Yes. I feel like I should turn the camera off or something like that. It feels underground. But Wittenberg Academy, I started a summer seminar in rhetorical theory, and tonight I'm doing live from Plano, Texas, at 8 o'clock at the Comfort Inn and Suites, Plano East. And we'll be talking about Aristotle's Metaphysics, a little selection from it, the first 3 chapters of Aristotle's Rhetoric, and the first 2 pages of the Topica. This is our second session, and it's just going to be a little discussion for what it's worth. It would be a great, I think you probably thought of this because it'd be a nice extension of today's session. Okay. Thank you all. I appreciate you.